Keanu Reeves, a man known for his down-to-earth and humble nature, stepped into the car dealership one quiet afternoon. His reputation as a kind and approachable celebrity preceded him. Dressed casually, he looked just like any other customer who would come in to browse cars. But what no one at the dealership expected was that this visit would quickly become the talk of the day. The dealership was a large, modern space, filled with shiny luxury cars lined up neatly. Each car had its own section, spotlighted under bright lights, looking more like works of art than vehicles. The scent of new leather and polished metal filled the air. Keanu wandered around, inspecting each car carefully. Despite his fame, he didn't seem out of place. He moved through the dealership with the same quiet confidence he displayed in his films. To the casual observer, he was just another person appreciating the finer things in life. At the same time, the dealership manager was pacing nervously in the back office, talking on the phone in a heated conversation with a difficult client. The manager, a man known for his sharp business sense, was always on edge. Today, however, things had gone from bad to worse. The client he was dealing with was extremely demanding, asking for a series of outrageous concessions. The pressure was building, and with each word exchanged, the manager's frustration grew. He muttered under his breath as he slammed down the phone, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Keanu, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, continued to stroll through the dealership, taking a genuine interest in the cars. His easygoing nature and kind demeanor made it clear that he wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a person with a genuine curiosity about the world around him. He stopped by a vintage car, running his fingers over the smooth surface, clearly admiring the craftsmanship. Meanwhile, the manager had calmed down a bit, but his day was still far from being a good one. He stepped out from the back office, now visibly irritated, with the frustration of the difficult conversation still lingering in his mind. It was in this moment that he noticed Keanu casually browsing the cars, seemingly at peace. The manager, not recognizing Keanu at first, assumed he was just another customer to deal with. He was already feeling the weight of the morning's difficulties, and the last thing he wanted was a conversation with anyone else. His patience was running thin. The moment he approached Keanu, it wasn't with a warm greeting, but with a slightly forced smile, masking the irritation in his voice. "Can I help you with anything?" he asked, trying to sound polite, though his tone carried the strain of the day's events. Keanu, who had never been one to show off his celebrity status, simply smiled back and said, "I'm just looking around for now, thank you." His voice was calm, as if he didn't have a care in the world, and his friendly smile made it clear he didn't expect anything more than a simple interaction. The manager, still tense, nodded and walked away, unsure of how to respond to the unassuming figure who seemed so out of place in such a tense atmosphere. The dealership's customers, who had been quietly observing the scene, were unaware of the celebrity in their midst. Keanu Reeves, despite being one of the most well-known actors in the world, had a way of blending into any environment. He was not looking for attention, nor was he trying to draw anyone's eyes. In fact, he seemed completely at peace in that moment, enjoying the simple pleasure of browsing the cars, just like any other customer. Little did anyone know that this quiet visit would soon turn into something none of them could have predicted. The stage was set, and the peaceful atmosphere of the dealership was about to take a dramatic turn, setting the stage for the shocking events that were about to unfold. The dealership had been bustling quietly with customers coming in and out, most of them just looking around or casually asking questions about the cars. The staff went about their work with their usual routines, keeping busy and assisting those who needed help. Keanu continued to explore, taking his time to examine the luxury cars with a quiet fascination. He appeared almost like a kid in a candy store, not rushing, but appreciating the craftsmanship and elegance of each model. His easygoing nature made it clear that he wasn't concerned with anything other than the experience. But inside the dealership's back office, the mood couldn't have been more different. The manager, whose name was Greg, had been struggling with an increasingly difficult client. He had dealt with unreasonable customers before, but this one was particularly hard to handle. The client wanted discounts that didn't make sense, constantly pushing for more concessions, as if the dealership owed him something. Greg tried to reason with him, but no matter how many times he explained the policies, the customer was relentless. As Greg ended the call with a sharp exhale, he ran his hand over his forehead, trying to shake off the anger that had built up during the conversation. He wasn't a man used to losing control, but the pressure of running a luxury car dealership had worn him thin that day. His mind was racing with thoughts of how he could resolve the issue with the customer while still keeping the business running smoothly. But everything felt like it was falling apart, and the frustration was eating at him. He stood up, needing to take a breather. The dealership wasn't just his job, it was his livelihood. His reputation was tied to every interaction, and with this particularly difficult customer, it felt like it was all at risk. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, but today, it seemed like nothing he did was good enough. As Greg made his way out of the back office, he caught sight of Keanu again. The actor was still walking around, now standing next to a sleek black sports car, studying its design intently. For a brief moment, Greg wondered what someone like Keanu Reeves was doing in a dealership like this. Was he truly interested in purchasing a car? Or was this just another public appearance, another photo op? Greg shook his head, trying to focus on his work. The last thing he needed was a distraction. He glanced at the rest of the showroom floor, noting that a few of the salespeople were busy with customers, while others seemed to be lingering near the coffee station. The place was functioning fine, yet his mind kept drifting back to that phone call. The pressure was mounting, and Greg wasn't sure how much more he could take. Without realizing it, his steps carried him closer to where Keanu stood. The actor was now gently running his hand over the smooth hood of the car, admiring its polish. There was something calming about Keanu's presence, but for Greg, it wasn't enough to shake off the heaviness he was feeling. He found himself frustrated by the situation, overwhelmed by the way the day was unfolding. Every little thing seemed to add more weight to his shoulders. Keanu, oblivious to the stress building up behind him, continued to take in the cars with his usual calm demeanor. The contrast between him and Greg couldn't have been starker. While Keanu seemed completely at ease, Greg was on the verge of losing it, and he couldn't seem to stop it. It was in this moment of heightened tension that the unexpected was about to happen. The building pressure would soon push Greg past his limit, leading to an incident that no one would have seen coming. The manager was struggling to keep it together, and in the next few moments, everything was about to change. What seemed like a regular day in the dealership was about to take an unexpected and dramatic turn. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air only seemed to grow heavier. Greg, the manager, stood near the back of the showroom, his mind racing with all the unresolved issues of the day. His eyes darted around the dealership, but they kept returning to Keanu, who was still admiring the cars as if he had all the time in the world. Greg felt a surge of frustration as he watched the actor, seemingly so calm and collected, while he himself was spiraling under the pressure of his responsibilities. The phone call earlier had been the tipping point. The angry client had drained the last of Greg's patience, and now, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, here he was, staring at Keanu Reeves, of all people, casually browsing through the showroom. To make matters worse, Greg felt a bit of resentment creeping in. He knew Keanu was a well-known actor, admired and respected by millions. But at that moment, Greg couldn't help but think that Keanu, with his calm presence, was just another distraction. He couldn't shake the feeling that the actor was somehow oblivious to the chaos Greg was enduring. Greg's frustration began to simmer beneath the surface. He wanted to get back to work, focus on the problems that needed fixing, but his thoughts kept getting tangled up in the mess of his own emotions. He needed a release, something to break the tension he was feeling. That's when he made an impulse decision, a decision he would regret. Without thinking it through, Greg marched over to where Keanu stood. The actor was now leaning on the sleek black sports car, lost in thought. For a moment, Keanu didn't notice Greg's approach, but as the manager got closer, he felt a strange sense of irritation rising within him. It wasn't about Keanu himself. It was the fact that Keanu's presence seemed to be the final straw in a day filled with mounting pressure. Greg's emotions were on edge, and in that moment, his frustration took over. "Are you planning to buy something, or are you just here to waste my time?" Greg blurted out, his voice sharper than he intended. The words were out before he could stop them, and there was an edge to his tone that shocked even him. He had meant to sound professional, but the stress of the day had finally caught up with him. Keanu, who had been looking at the car, turned slowly to face Greg. His calm demeanor remained, and he simply raised an eyebrow in surprise. "I'm just looking," Keanu replied softly, his voice still calm and friendly. There was no trace of annoyance in his response. He was just a man browsing through the cars, not a celebrity who expected special treatment. But to Greg, Keanu's answer felt like a dismissal. Something about the way the actor responded, so effortlessly cool and collected, made Greg's irritation flare up again. He wasn't sure why, but Keanu's calmness only seemed to heighten his own frustration. Without thinking, Greg's hand shot out, and in a split second, he shoved Keanu, pushing him away from the car. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to send a message that Greg didn't even fully understand. The people nearby, including some customers, gasped in shock, witnessing this unexpected outburst. Keanu, still unfazed, took a small step back, his expression unchanged. The situation had turned awkward in an instant, and the entire dealership fell silent. Greg stood there for a moment, his chest heaving with the adrenaline rush that followed his impulsive action. He couldn't believe what he had just done. What had started as a small irritation had exploded into something far worse than he could have imagined. His face reddened with embarrassment as he realized the gravity of the situation. But to his surprise, Keanu didn't react with anger. Instead, he simply stood there, looking at Greg, still calm and composed. The silence hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Keanu didn't say a word. Instead, he just waited for the next move. It was in this moment of stillness that Greg realized the true weight of his actions. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. The tension that had been building for so long was about to take an unexpected turn, but what Keanu did next would change everything. The entire dealership seemed to freeze in place after Greg's unexpected action. The air felt thick with tension as everyone watched, uncertain of what would happen next. Greg, still standing in front of Keanu, felt his heart race. He had just pushed a man who was not only a complete stranger but also a well-known figure. What had he done? What was Keanu going to do in return? For a brief moment, Greg thought the actor might lash out, his calm demeanor giving way to anger. It would have been completely understandable. After all, Greg had just shoved him, something no one should ever have to experience. But instead of a confrontation, there was something else entirely. Keanu stood there, without a hint of aggression in his eyes. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, and he didn't even take a step back. There was no visible sign of anger or frustration, only a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to reach through the tension in the room. Greg shifted uncomfortably, the silence between them growing more intense by the second. His hand, which had pushed Keanu just moments before, now felt heavy at his side, as though it were weighed down by the mistake he had made. The other customers who had witnessed the incident stood frozen, waiting for some kind of reaction from Keanu, as if they were unsure of how to handle what had just transpired. Keanu, however, did not respond the way Greg had expected. Instead of an angry outburst, or even a harsh word, he simply gave a small, understanding smile. It was a smile that seemed to say, "It's okay." There was no malice in his expression, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance of the situation. Greg felt a strange sensation wash over him. The anger that had been building inside him now seemed trivial in comparison to Keanu's calmness. His frustration, which had been at a boiling point just moments ago, now felt like an overreaction. What was he doing? Why had he let something so small push him to this extreme? The question lingered in his mind as he stood before Keanu, utterly unsure of how to proceed. Keanu then spoke softly, his voice carrying an air of quiet wisdom. "You're having a tough day, I can tell. But you don't have to take it out on others," he said, his tone gentle but firm. It wasn't a reprimand. It wasn't meant to make Greg feel worse. Instead, it felt like a simple observation, one that somehow cut through the noise in Greg's head. Greg stared at him, stunned by the kindness in Keanu's words. He had been expecting some sort of argument, or maybe even a confrontation, but instead, Keanu was offering something far more valuable: understanding. It was like a cool breeze on a hot day, and it disarmed Greg in a way he hadn't thought possible. The manager's face flushed with embarrassment. He had acted on impulse, allowing his emotions to cloud his judgment. But now, in the face of Keanu's calm and composed reaction, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: guilt. He was deeply aware of how unprofessional he had been and how unnecessary his actions had been. But Keanu wasn't holding it against him. Instead, he seemed to be offering a chance to reset, to make things right. Greg's mind raced, unsure of what to do next. He wanted to apologize, to explain himself, but he didn't know where to start. How could he explain the pressure he had been under? The frustration that had built up over the course of the day, spilling over in a moment of weakness. Before he could speak, Keanu took a small step forward. His eyes were kind and patient, as though he had all the time in the world to listen. "It happens," Keanu said quietly. "We all have our breaking points, but what matters is how we move forward from here." Greg didn't know what to say. He had expected an angry confrontation, but what he was receiving instead was an unexpected lesson in patience and humility. Keanu's words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight. It was as if the world had slowed down for a moment, and Greg was given a chance to reflect on his actions. For a moment, Greg just stood there, feeling the weight of the situation slowly lift. His shoulders, which had been tense with frustration, seemed to relax. The anger that had bubbled inside him earlier now felt misplaced. Keanu had shown him a level of grace that Greg hadn't expected, and it was having a profound effect on him. He took a deep breath, and for the first time that day, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about the car dealership or the difficult customer. It was about something deeper. It was about how one person's reaction could change the course of an entire moment. And Keanu, with his simple yet powerful presence, had done just that. Greg finally opened his mouth, his voice soft. "I'm sorry. That was completely uncalled for." It was the first step toward fixing what he had broken. And with Keanu's quiet acceptance, Greg realized that the path to redemption didn't always require grand. The silence that had followed Greg's apology seemed to stretch on forever. For a moment, it felt as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath. Keanu stood there, still calm, his presence steady and unshaken. His gentle expression never wavered, and it was clear that he wasn't expecting anything more from Greg. There was no judgment in his eyes, only an understanding that seemed to say, "It's all right. We all make mistakes." Greg, on the other hand, felt a mixture of embarrassment and relief. His apology had been genuine, but he wasn't sure if it would be enough to undo the mistake he had made. Yet, as he looked at Keanu, he felt something strange. The weight of the tension between them was slowly lifting. Keanu's kindness had a way of calming the storm inside Greg's chest. It was like a balm to his frayed nerves, and the guilt that had been gnawing at him began to fade away. Keanu's calm response continued to work its magic. There was no anger, no attempt to make Greg feel worse. Instead, Keanu did something entirely unexpected. He took a small step toward Greg, extending his hand in a gesture that felt like a bridge between the two men. It wasn't just a handshake. It was an offer of reconciliation, a silent invitation to move past the awkwardness and start anew. Greg blinked in surprise. The actor wasn't just offering forgiveness in his words, but in his actions as well. He extended his hand, and for a moment, Greg hesitated. Was he really about to shake hands with Keanu Reeves? The same Keanu Reeves he had just shoved minutes ago. It seemed unreal, yet there was something about the way Keanu was offering it that made Greg believe it could be that simple. Taking a deep breath, Greg reached out and accepted the handshake. Their hands met, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. Greg had expected to feel awkward, even ashamed, but instead, there was an overwhelming sense of peace. Keanu's handshake wasn't just a physical gesture. It felt like an invitation to let go of the past, to forgive oneself, and to move forward. "Thank you," Greg said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. He hadn't expected the situation to unfold like this. He had imagined confrontation, perhaps even anger, but Keanu's response had been something entirely different. It was the kind of response that made Greg realize how much of his frustration had been misdirected. In that moment, it wasn't about the car dealership or the difficult customer. It was about the way he had handled himself, the way he had allowed his emotions to get the best of him. Keanu smiled, still as warm and genuine as before. "No need to thank me," he said softly. "We all have our moments. What matters is that you can learn from it." The simplicity of Keanu's words left a lasting impact on Greg. It wasn't a lecture or a stern rebuke. It was a gentle reminder that everyone, no matter who they are, faces challenges. What really mattered was how you chose to handle them. Greg felt a deep sense of gratitude. The weight that had been pressing down on him for hours seemed to have evaporated, and for the first time that day, he felt lighter. Keanu hadn't just forgiven him. He had shown him how to forgive himself. And in doing so, he had offered a powerful lesson in humility and grace. The dealership, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt like a different place altogether. The customers who had witnessed the incident were still watching, but the atmosphere had shifted. Instead of feeling uncomfortable or unsure, they were witnessing something rare, a moment of genuine understanding between two people, one of whom happened to be a global celebrity. It was an unspoken reminder that even the most high-profile individuals are still human, capable of kindness and compassion. As Greg stood there, shaking hands with Keanu, he realized that this was the kind of interaction that would stay with him long after the day had ended. It wasn't the cars, the sale, or even the difficult customer that would define this day. It was the way one simple moment of kindness had transformed everything. And in that moment, Greg knew that he would never forget the lesson Keanu had taught him. Keanu released Greg's hand, still smiling. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly before turning to walk toward the door. Greg watched him go, still in awe of how effortlessly the actor had turned an awkward, difficult moment into something meaningful. As Keanu left the dealership, the tension that had once filled the room disappeared entirely. Greg stood there, feeling like a different person. He had learned something valuable that day, not from a textbook or a lecture, but from a simple, unexpected interaction with someone who understood the importance of kindness and forgiveness. As Keanu walked toward the exit of the dealership, the atmosphere seemed to shift completely. The tension that had previously hung thick in the air was now gone, replaced with a calm that felt almost surreal. Greg, still standing by the cars, felt his heartbeat slow, the frantic energy of the day slowly receding. It was as if the weight of his frustration and anger had been lifted, and in its place, there was something that felt like peace. The customers who had been quietly observing the scene were still in their own little bubbles of disbelief. They had all seen the incident unfold, but now they were left to reflect on what had just happened. Some of them exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of it. After all, it wasn't every day that they saw a famous actor handle an uncomfortable situation with such grace and understanding. Keanu's quiet confidence and his willingness to remain calm had left them in awe. For Greg, however, the moment wasn't just about what had happened between him and Keanu. It was about the realization that his actions, no matter how small they seemed at the time, had consequences. He had reacted impulsively, allowing his emotions to get the better of him. But Keanu, in his quiet wisdom, had shown him a different way, a way that didn't rely on anger or frustration, but on understanding and patience. As the dealership slowly returned to normal, Greg took a moment to collect his thoughts. He needed to process what had just occurred. He was still surprised by how Keanu had handled everything. Instead of reacting to Greg's outburst with anger or retaliation, Keanu had responded with compassion. It was something Greg hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. He realized then that Keanu had given him more than just an apology. The actor had shown him a powerful lesson in humility and self-control. In the face of Greg's outburst, Keanu hadn't become defensive. Instead, he had listened and responded with kindness. It was a reminder that no matter how difficult a situation might seem, there was always a way to handle it with dignity and respect. Greg walked over to the counter, feeling a newfound sense of clarity. He glanced around the dealership, his mind processing everything that had happened. The place felt different now. The cars on the showroom floor didn't seem as important as they had just an hour ago. What mattered now was the way he treated people, how he handled conflict, how he interacted with others, and how he learned to control his emotions in the heat of the moment. The other staff members, who had been watching from the sidelines, now began to move about the showroom again. They had witnessed the entire interaction, and like the customers, were left speechless by what they had seen. The story of Keanu's visit would certainly be one they would talk about for days to come. But it was more than just a story of a celebrity behaving graciously. It was a reminder that everyone, no matter who they were, had the ability to make a positive impact in even the most unexpected of circumstances. As Greg stood there, still thinking about the encounter, he realized that he had learned more from Keanu in those few moments than he had in a long time. He wasn't sure if Keanu knew just how much his simple actions had affected him, but it was clear that the actor had left an impression that would stay with him forever. Greg felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that he needed to take the lesson Keanu had taught him to heart. Life was full of challenges, and there would always be moments when emotions ran high. But it was how you chose to respond in those moments that defined you. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being kind, being patient, and finding a way to move forward with integrity. Just as the dealership started to return to its usual rhythm, Greg felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was a peace that came from knowing that he had been given a second chance, not just to make things right with Keanu, but to improve himself, to handle difficult situations with the same grace and understanding that Keanu had shown him. As the day wore on, Greg found himself reflecting on how much of his life had been spent reacting out of frustration or impatience. It was time for a change, he realized. He didn't need to be perfect, but he could certainly strive to be better. And Keanu's simple, powerful act of kindness had given him the inspiration he needed to start. Meanwhile, outside the dealership, Keanu's car drove off into the distance, leaving behind a man forever changed by a moment of compassion. What seemed like an ordinary visit had turned into something extraordinary, not just for Greg, but for everyone who had witnessed it. In the end, it wasn't about the cars, the sales, or the stressful phone calls. It was about the people, the connections they made, and the lessons they learned along the way. As the day continued, the atmosphere at the dealership slowly returned to normal, though it felt lighter than before. Greg couldn't help but reflect on the interaction he had just experienced. The simple act of kindness from Keanu had stayed with him, lingering in his mind long after the actor had left. It wasn't just the apology or the handshake that had made an impact. It was the way Keanu had approached the situation with such grace, offering not just forgiveness, but understanding. Greg felt a shift inside himself. He had always prided himself on being professional, but there had been times when his patience had worn thin, and he had allowed his emotions to take the lead. It had happened before in stressful situations, but this time, something had clicked. Keanu's ability to stay calm, even when faced with the unexpected, had shown him a new way to approach challenges. It wasn't about suppressing emotions or pretending that everything was fine. It was about taking a moment to breathe, to reflect, and to choose a better response. Greg sat at his desk for a while, processing everything that had happened. He thought about how quickly things had escalated earlier, how one small moment of frustration had almost ruined what could have been a peaceful day. But Keanu had taught him that mistakes didn't have to define you. What mattered was what you did next, how you responded, and whether you were willing to learn from the experience. Greg had learned something valuable that day. He had learned that it was okay to make mistakes, but it was more important to learn how to move forward from them. As he went about his work, Greg found himself smiling more than usual. His mind was clearer, his thoughts more focused. He had always been dedicated to his job, but now he was approaching it with a new sense of purpose. The way he interacted with others, the way he handled pressure, it all felt different. Instead of reacting impulsively, he found himself taking a breath, stepping back, and thinking before acting. It was a change that felt both refreshing and empowering. Over the next few hours, Greg had a few more interactions with customers, but each conversation felt easier. The pressure that had once made him feel tense and on edge now seemed more manageable. There was still work to be done, still challenges to face, but now he knew that he didn't have to face them alone. His experience with Keanu had taught him that it was okay to ask for help, to lean on others, and to be patient with himself when things didn't go as planned. The customers, too, seemed to notice the difference in Greg. They commented on how friendly and approachable he seemed, how willing he was to listen to their questions and offer thoughtful answers. It was a side of him that hadn't been so apparent before. The stress and tension that had clouded his interactions earlier in the day were gone, replaced by a genuine warmth and attentiveness. As the sun began to set, casting a soft glow through the dealership windows, Greg felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if the lessons he had learned from Keanu had given him a fresh perspective on life. He realized that it wasn't just about handling customers or making sales. It was about being present, being kind, and taking the time to truly connect with the people around him. When the dealership closed for the evening, Greg sat at his desk for a while, reflecting on the day. It had started out with so much tension, so much uncertainty, but it had ended in a way he never could have predicted. Keanu's kindness had made all the difference. It had turned what could have been a moment of conflict into a moment of growth. Greg smiled to himself as he thought about how lucky he had been to witness such a simple, yet profound, act of kindness. He had learned something that day, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't about how much you achieved or how perfect you were. It was about how you treated others, how you responded to the challenges that life threw your way, and how willing you were to learn and grow from each experience. And as he locked up the dealership and walked out into the cool evening air, Greg knew that this day, this lesson, would shape the way he approached everything moving forward. Keanu's impact had been more than just a lesson in forgiveness. It had been a lesson in living with intention and compassion, in recognizing that we all have the power to change and improve, no matter the circumstances. As Greg headed home, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected encounter that had turned his day and his perspective around. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, there could be something extraordinary. And sometimes, it only took a small act of kindness to make a lasting difference. The next morning, Greg arrived at the dealership earlier than usual. The quiet of the showroom felt different now, almost like a new beginning. As he walked through the front doors, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over him. Yesterday had been a turning point, and it wasn't just about what had happened with Keanu. It was the change within himself that he was starting to notice. He wasn't sure if everyone would notice, but Greg felt different. The pressure he had once placed on himself to be perfect had started to lift. It wasn't about trying to control every situation or have all the answers. It was about accepting that life was unpredictable and messy sometimes, but that didn't mean it had to overwhelm him. Keanu had taught him something crucial, that being kind, staying composed, and giving people the benefit of the doubt could make all the difference. As he started his day, Greg took the time to smile at the staff, chat with a few of the customers who walked in, and really listen to their questions. He wasn't in a rush anymore. He didn't feel the need to have everything figured out immediately. Instead of pushing people through quick conversations just to get things done, he gave them the space to talk and shared a laugh or two. The change in his approach was subtle but noticeable. By mid-morning, one of the salespeople, a young woman named Sarah, came up to Greg. She smiled at him and said, "You know, Greg, you've been in such a good mood today. It's really nice to see." Greg chuckled softly. "I guess I just realized it's better to slow down and enjoy the moment." "Thanks for noticing, Sarah." It was a small moment, but it felt significant. The dealership wasn't just a place for selling cars. It had become a space where people felt comfortable and seen. The customers that came in felt the warmth in the air too, responding to Greg's shift in energy. There was no longer the sense of rush or pressure. Instead, there was an unspoken calm that allowed for more genuine connections to form. Throughout the day, Greg found himself reflecting on his own personal growth. He had learned so much from that brief interaction with Keanu. The actor had left the dealership the day before, but his impact remained. It was as if Keanu's simple act of kindness had opened a door in Greg's mind, a door to a new way of thinking and being. The kindness wasn't just about the apology, it was about the entire approach to life. The day passed quickly, and as it drew to a close, Greg felt a quiet satisfaction. The work had gone smoothly, the customers had been happy, and most importantly, he felt at peace with himself. He knew that he wasn't perfect, but that was okay. He didn't need to be. What mattered was how he treated people, how he responded when life got tough, and how he learned to let go of the small frustrations that used to overwhelm him. As he prepared to leave for the night, Greg locked the door behind him and paused for a moment outside. The city was calm, and the air was cool. It felt like the world had slowed down, just like he had. And in that stillness, Greg realized something important. Kindness had the power to transform not only situations but people as well. It was a lesson he would carry with him from this day forward. Keanu Reeves had come into the dealership for a simple visit, but the effect of that visit had been profound. It wasn't about the celebrity or the status. It was about the quiet strength and compassion Keanu had shown in the face of a difficult moment. And it was this lesson that Greg would carry with him into every part of his life from then on. As Greg drove home, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The dealership, his work, and his relationships with others would never be the same again. He had learned to approach life with more kindness, patience, and understanding. And in doing so, he had learned to embrace himself more fully, flaws and all. It had been an unexpected journey, but one that he would never forget.